Well, I have an undergraduate degree in economics, but I didn't have a good enough degree to actually be an economist. so what I decided I would work in at the time was in planning, town planning, and do a kind of internship, well, not an internship, but a kind of apprenticeship style position. And so I applied for jobs and I got offered one, and then I was invited to apply for another one more locally, near where I live. It was for a special project, and it was a 2-year contract to do these special plans. And I found myself special plans for new towns, town expansion, and I found myself doing a bit of recreation work for that. But then but what I really enjoyed doing was the research. So on population growth, economics, and so on. And so some jobs came up at the University of Birmingham in a new Centre for Urban and Regional Studies, and I applied for that, a general job, and they did work on leisure, but also housing, industrial development, urban things. And I applied for the job and got it, but I didn't know what I was going to be working on. It was a research associate post. But the first job I got was to finish or help finish off a job for the Sports Council on sport research, which was led by Dr. Tim Burton, who since went to America and then in Canada. And from then on, I seemed to find myself doing leisure, recreation, sport, and so on projects with money coming. It was all externally funded from the Sports Council and the Countryside Commission and government departments and that sort of thing, but at the university. And that I was there for 11 years and had 13 separate contracts. And then I got a full permanent job at the North London Polytechnic, teaching, and then my last job was here at what was a college at the time, and then became University of Technology. So that's my professional history. Well, I was thinking about this coming down in the train, and I was thinking, I'll be the only honest person in your survey or your interviews, and so I probably, like everybody else in all the surveys, spend more time watching television than anything else. But I do mix that with one eye on the television, one eye reading the newspaper, one eye sometimes some academic reading and so on, and sort of. But in terms of, and then I'll also be honest and say, probably the next one would be in time, maybe would be, meeting up with friends and going for a meal or a drink and things like that. So my leisure is virtually all casual leisure, nothing serious. The nearest I get to something serious would be my garden. I've got a large garden. Large by some people's standards, about 3/4 of an acre, 3,000 square meters. And that takes up quite a bit of my time and is a sort of hobby, but I don't really have enough time for it to be really serious, because it's all I can do to keep the grass cut and the weeds down. And I do have a swimming pool in the garden, so I swim in the summer when I've managed to get the pool clean and sparkling for the summer. I do some swimming. Well, I was thinking about this as well, and I reflected on that if you listen to interviews on the media, on the radio or television, they interview great artists or whatever, um, say a museum director or something, and they nearly always ask them to name their favourite whatever film that they've made or book that they've written or something, and they never do, hardly ever, because they say they always love them all, or sometimes they prefer one and sometimes the other. And I think that's probably true for me. I think it depends. But looking back, I would say if it was one event which was particularly significant was my first no, it wasn't my first overseas solid, it was my second. I'd been to Norway with a friend, hitchhiking, but I went to France and went to the south of France to join a friend who had rented a house near Saint-Tropez, and I went by train, and I can just remember the total the graduate. I went to. I was on the sleeper, and I went to sleep in Northern Europe, and woke up in Southern Europe with all that, olive groves and sunshine and a different light altogether. And I can remember that being very romantic, very exotic. So that's one thing, and I think another slightly different experience was a period of time, and it was when I was living in Birmingham, which at the time wasn't really the centre of the world and the centre of culture, much more is now. But I was there in the from 1968 until 1980. So in that very late 60s and early 70s, and in the 70s, with a very exciting time culturally. And I just remember there was a nightclub where I used to. I was quite a workaholic even then. I would work in the evenings in the office, catching up on my research projects or whatever, and sometimes go to the pub at about 9:30. But this club, it was one club in particular, opened at about 11 and stayed open till 1, and would have very good bands from the rock era, punk era, and so on. And that also was somewhat exotic, to go out somewhere after the pubs had closed and go and see these bands, some of them quite prominent bands, national names, and sometimes before they'd really broken to really big. So I mean, it was a big club that could accommodate 1,000 people or something, in a very sort of non-organised. It wasn't a tiered thing. It was sort of a nightclub layout. And I just remember that period. It's very sort of almost exciting, because it was part of the cultural music scene which I managed to find, even though I wasn't in London, which is where it was all happening.
Interesting.
You put tourism first, but I always put leisure first, and that's been my thing. And one of the big changes was that when I arrived here, I may be exaggerating now, but I think that tourism and even things like sport management and so on weren't on the map particularly, except as part of the leisure studies scene. And leisure seemed to recruit students to work in the public sector, in local government and state government particularly, and sometimes the voluntary sector, third sector. And it seemed to attract sufficient students, but probably at the college, I was the predecessor to this, I was at, sufficient students to run a course would be to recruit 70 a year. But that's not enough now. You need 150 or something, minimum. If you don't have that, then it's not a viable course. So So for several years that went quite well, but then we ourselves developed tourism as a specialty, and that became bigger than the original leisure, more attractive to students. And later on, we developed sport management, which seemed almost as big as the leisure, and most recently, effectively, the leisure part was converted into an events management course. And I remember I was involved in reorganizing the programs after I'd retired, and we had a program, a 3-year program, with a set of top units, subjects, and things on events were electives, optional, and other subjects were part of the core. And really all we did was change some of those over to make events core and the other things electives, and called it events, leisure and events or something. And the application has doubled in a year and brought the leisure back from the brink. So the big question I always have, and I know it's the teaching side rather than the research side, is what makes 17-year-old students, because they're 17 when they apply for the university, what makes them tick? And that's the thing that we need to do research on. And I suggested it in a report I did, but I don't think we've done the research, because they come to the university involved and very badly informed about the course they're actually attending, and don't realize, for instance, they've got to do accounting because it's a management course, but it's all on the internet, it's on the brochure, but they haven't really taken it in, and they've got some idea in their heads, And of course we do interviews with students who are on the course, but it's always students who don't come on the course or came and reject. You almost want to know what the whole range of options, the choice mechanism is and what they're talking about. So that's the teaching side of it. So really the leisure has now really faded from view, and some of us who grew up with leisure, and Stephen Waring would be a case in point, can teach across a range of topics, leisure, tourism, events, or whatever, from our base. But often now when you recruit new people, their specialties are sport or tourism or events, not the background of leisure. So even while we see all these things as part of leisure, the people now teaching them don't necessarily see the leisure connect. They might see the connection, but they're not based in that original subject area. As far as the research is concerned, I think we've had our good moments and bad moments in Australia. Some of the interesting things were done back in the 70s by the government, the Labour government. Gough Whitlam's very famous, who established the training system for the colleges to look at leisure, and then also commissioned research. So, for example, some of the first major publications on women at leisure in the UK came in 1985. Conferences and stuff earlier, but the books and so on came. Whereas in Australia, the first report was commissioned by that government in 1975. So there's some things happening quite early on with government funding. And there's been national surveys, like there is in most countries, which have had a very checkered career on participation rates and so on. But I think, and we failed to, as a research community, we failed to really get a big head of steam going for research and getting major funding and that sort of thing. And one of the problems was that ironically, that when the courses were originally established, which provided the jobs, people who even do research, but you needed a job first in teaching, as everywhere, or mostly. When they were established, it was in colleges, not in universities. And then in 1990-91, like, as in Britain, the colleges were all amalgamated into the universities. So it became a whole, it used to be a binary system, you know, colleges, which were teaching only, and universities. Now it's a unitary system with just universities. Well, what happened then is a lot of staff, who my colleagues, suddenly found themselves in a university. And a university requires you to do research, which they may not have done before. They may have done consultancy, but they concentrated on teaching. But it also requires you, for promotion, you have to have a PhD. And many of the people did not have a PhD. I don't have a PhD. But I'd done so much research over the years that I ducked under the wire and was allowed to supervise PhDs and so on, just because of my personal record. But not very many people were in that position. A few were. So the people who were like senior lecturers and maybe had 15 or 20 years in the system and knew leisure studies and knew it backwards, suddenly had to do a PhD part-time over 5 years, with some time off. And that, I think, preoccupied a large proportion of the academic people who were involved in leisure studies. And you say that's good because they were required to do research, and of course it is a good thing. But especially if you're working on your own part-time, you have to narrow your focus to do a PhD, do in-depth in a very small topic. And so what we ended up, I think, and I don't criticize the individuals, it's the system required them to do this. People who might have had quite a broad view of leisure ended up with their speciality was one group doing one activity in one location. And that's what they gained for a long period of time, because they would do their PhD and then do their article, their papers for conferences and so on. So it's probably almost a 10-year period at their prime, where they're required to do this, what is normally done when you're in your 20s or 30s, and they were doing it in their 40s and 50s. And I think that affected the development of the field, because it fragmented into all these separate little PhD. And we did what Ken Roberts has called, we ended up, and he's talked about it in regard to leisure studies generally. So, but this is my explanation. He calls it concentrating on little leisures rather than big questions. And the ANZALS conference here in December is on social change and leisure. And I'm doing a paper on this very issue and saying, because we're concerned with little leisure, we haven't been involved with social change, except at this micro level, you know. So we can look out at theories of social change from within my study of, you know, youth cycling or something. I'm not dealing with the issue. And an example, of course, is, which you've been involved with, is with the work I've done on human rights. Well, that's a big question, but it's been ignored by leisure studies, and even papers on things which you'd think might come across human rights, like some of the feminist stuff, hasn't really used that language and made that connection. So, I don't know whether that's enough as a picture. So it's a bit negative, but for a while it was quite stimulating to be in a, and of course from my own point of view, we operate now on a global platform anyway, and so the fact that I'm in Australia or one is in any country doesn't stop you from dealing with big issues like human rights or inequality or social change. So it hasn't stopped those who want to do it. And there would be one other thing. There's one other point that comes to mind, which is part of the problem and the reason for us failing to get momentum, is that one of the attractions of, or one of the merits of leisure studies is its interdisciplinary nature. So the people who get senior positions in this field have to manage interdisciplinary work with people from, in a small school you might have somebody who's a marketing person from a business angle. You're dealing with accounting courses, maybe done by another department, but you may have some Marxist sociologists or feminists or whatever. So you're dealing with this breadth. So what's one of the consequences of this is they become quite good at handling the cross currents and handling people and managing, and there's some very good people. So what happens? They get promoted because they're so good at it. So we joined University of Technology, Sydney, and we were a staff of about 20, and we joined a faculty of business with 150 staff, with economists and marketing and accounting and management and so on. And in the 1990s, we produced 2 deans who did 8 years, about 12 years altogether. And I noticed it in other universities. The head of the leisure section gets promoted to be a pro-vice chancellor or a dean or an associate dean and that sort of thing. And you wouldn't expect it because we're the minnows, we're the small fry. Well, that's good, because if you have the dean from your school, at least he knows what leisure studies is about and is not misinformed like some others. So we were sort of protected, although we had to perform like everybody else. But what it meant was that senior people who might also provide an academic leadership role went off to do management. And you think that's a very small number, but there were probably about half a dozen people in Australia and New Zealand, for that matter, who found themselves doing that, and then never really played the role that they might have played otherwise in leading the academic field. So, and that's one of the reasons why I only did a very short spell and came back to being an ordinary academic and retired early in order to carry on doing my research, because I could so easy to get drawn into this these management tasks and become a bureaucrat. I mean, the job has to be done, but so that's another feature, and I think it might happen in other areas as well. I don't know whether it's common. Well, I mean, if I talk about leisure, the leisure of Australians, I think one of the interesting features of it is that Australia's identity is bound up with leisure. The bronzed Aussie is the term, i.e. sunburnt on the beach and doing that sort of thing. And I remember once I actually wrote to my only letter has been published to the Sydney Morning Herald, when a columnist referred to swimming as the I forget the term she used now, but it was like the typical Australian leisure activity. And I wrote this letter to point out that in the national survey, you qualify as a participant in an activity if you've done it once in the year. And this is adults aged 15 and over. And the proportion of Australians who have been swimming as a recreational activity in the course of the year is 12%. And it counts if you've been once. So if you swam once when you went on holiday, that you'd be in. So it's hardly, so 88% did not swim once with all this. You know, and 90% of them living within 10 kilometers of the coast. So there's a lot of myths about about Australian leisure, but because Australia's performed very well internationally in sport, for example, and it's particularly this active side of things. Australia has its own image of itself as a sporting nation, and in fact, it's not very different from European countries and Americans. And then, of course, the problem then is that the people involved with the arts then suffer from that, because Australian isn't thought of as a culturally, you know, sophisticated country, and so they're always fighting a rearguard action to say, yes, no, we do have great singers and great composers and great. We only have one Nobel Prize in literature, but they have anyway. So that's one about the myths. I think an awful lot of myths. Well, first of all, it depends how broadly you draw the picture of leisure. I mean, it seems to me that if we understood how this business I had about how the students tick, it seems as if young people who want to come to university, there's always a certain proportion, it's quite small, but want to do something in our area. But whatever is fashionable changes, it seems. So it once was leisure, as I said, tourism, sport management, and event management. It seems to me now, event management, which is maybe the flavour of the month, might go into decline, but chances are something else similar would rise to take its place, because there would always be, it seems to me, probably, this is a sort of theory, some young people who would want to do something of that sort, you know, related to the leisure field as a career. So I would say there'll always be something, but of course in academia, the more students you have in the field, the more you end up having specialties, because you have courses and subjects related to this field, and therefore people identify with that, and therefore they do research in that. So even though broadly the field will survive, it seemed to me, leisure as a field, as a topic in its own right, possibly encompassing all of them, or dealing with unique leisure issues, will continue to decline in a kind of institutional sense. So we'd no longer have departments, schools of leisure studies. We know, in fact, about 2 years ago, the word leisure disappeared. The last degree that we had no longer had even "and leisure" in it. It's just event management, and I think that's happening certainly in the Anglosphere. But what is interesting, I think, is, and in a way, I've seen the whole thing almost, because I was sort of beginning to come into the field in the late '60s, and I was present and helped host the conference where the Leisure Studies Association was founded in the UK in 1975, and I was here in 1991 when the Australian and New Zealand Association for Leisure Studies was founded. And I've been on the editorial board of the Leisure Studies Journal in England since 1982, and I was editor of the Ansell's journal for about 5 years, and then involved with the board and so on. So I've sort of seen the whole thing come and go, almost institutionally, and I've seen these departments rise and fall and the fragmentation. But it seems to me the umbrella organisations and the journals and the conferences seem to be as strong as ever. So, for instance, Leisure Studies in the UK I think if you get an article approved now for leisure studies, which is rivals the American ones now, it'll be 18 months or 2 years before it actually appears in the journal, because they've got this long queue of online publications. That's very healthy. And you'll meet Neil Carr, and he's the journal editor here now, and that seems to be going very strongly. They've got a great queue of paper, no shortage. The conferences are smaller, about 100 and something, whereas they did peak at about 300. But that's viable. You could have a decent conference with 100. And of course, at the world level, the World Leisure Journal is doing similarly a good job. Whether it will survive the new competition of, it's a new journal coming out in sociology of leisure, I don't know. But it seemed to me, as a field of study, which draws on people from all sorts of disciplines, it seemed to me it's established and will continue. Because those journals publish papers from people from all sorts, from sociology departments, from economics departments and so on, as well as from and when you have a conference, the local people in particular, so you have a conference in Sydney, the people from tourism or from cultural studies or whatever will come to the Leisure Studies Association if you've got various themes in the conference which suit their field. It's lost its institutional presence, and it may even, I think what will happen is that leisure as a field in its own right will be a personal matter. It'll be individuals who say, I'm a leisure specialist, or a professor of leisure studies, or I'm a sociologist and one of my fields of interest is leisure, rather than a department with the name over the door saying leisure studies. So I would be quite hopeful, insofar as I have a soft spot for leisure as a field of studies. I'm quite optimistic that it'll continue to be a focus of research and study and publication in the future. Well, I don't think. I'm actually finishing a book at the moment called "Whatever Happened to the Leisure Society," and I'm grappling with the last chapter because the whole business of the leisure society and the future of work and so on goes in waves from way back in the 1930s actually, and then certainly in the 60s and 90s and so on. And we're suddenly in a wave where you get consultancy reports, books, and so on by various authors, and the big theme at the moment, the line of research which could affect leisure, is this talk that as much as 40% of the jobs which people are doing today are expected to disappear in the next 30 years. That's the kind of headline news, which the newspapers love, But in fact, if you read a more sensible paper by some economists at the OECD, they say it's only 9%. It is not over whatever it is, 20 years is not an awful lot. And so I'm faced with this stuff which I'm grappling with at the moment on the future of work. And I think of my own career, I was never taught any leisure studies at school or at university. I was never taught to use a computer at school or university. 90% of things I do, I was never taught anything about anywhere. So I think, but I feel I had a good education which equipped me for a changing world. And I think I didn't even do economics at school, even though I did an economics degree. I had a broad, what was called in the Anglosphere anyway, liberal education. So I did Latin, for heaven's sake. I won't say everyone should do Latin anymore. But you should study language, you should study history, you should study mathematics, you should study your own language and your literature and your history and so on. That's the broad liberal education. And I think all the rest is up to you as an individual. And one of the other things which I thought came across only in the last few days is that an awful lot of the new stuff which they go on about in some of these papers, which you need retraining for, can be done very quickly. And if you wanted to learn coding, or whatever they call it now, for computers, you could go and do a 6-month course and be competent at entry level, which we did in the old days. You might not remember, but I actually have learned 3 computer languages, Algol, Fortran, and Basic, none of which are any use to me now. And I think one of them I did use in my first job at a university and wrote some programs. But those courses, one of them was a 4-day course, one of them was an evening course for 1 semester, and one of them I just picked up as I went along. That's what I'm doing. Some of this stuff you can learn if you're a competent person and motivated. You can learn it very quickly, and sometimes you can learn it on the job. I mean, you can go on courses of how to use an Excel spreadsheet. Well, I can use an Excel spreadsheet, but I've never been on a course, and so on. But the big trouble is, of course, if I'd been in an American school, at least I would have learned to touch type, whereas I type with 2 fingers. So that's a limitation of my theory, I suppose. But I can type as quickly as I can think. So I'm not in a panic mode that young people must learn all this stuff because otherwise they won't have a job. If they're educated as educated individuals in a traditional way, they will adapt. Yeah. As most people did. I mean, people keep saying this is an period of unprecedented change, and I think of my grandmother who lived through 2 world wars and saw the arrival of the motor car and electricity and the radio and television, and you say we're facing change? I think previous generations faced as much change as we did. Mm-hmm. Sometimes more dramatic, more traumatic. I have given a presentation on this, but on a narrow part of it, so I haven't done this yet. What this paper is I published says is that the serious leisure perspective, and one has to have great admiration for Bob Stebbins for working at something and make it so well known and popular for 40 years, which is what he's done. It's an extraordinary tour de force. But my critique of it is on 2 grounds. The serious leisure perspective, which encompasses not just serious leisure but casual leisure and project. Yeah, it's a 3-fold thing, which Stebbins says covers everything. So that perspective is both a classification system, so it classifies leisure into 3 categories, and then subcategories underneath that. Classification, like the table of elements or something. And it also claims to be theoretical, and a theory has to explain things. Well, very quickly, as far as the classification system is concerned, it has 3 categories, and then beneath that he's got particular activities. Drinking in a pub is a casual activity, and playing certain types of sport is a serious leisure activity. Well, my view is you can't divide activities like that. 90% of activities, 95% of activities can't be divided like that. And he himself gives an example, as he talks about a child playing a piano. Now, I can learn to play the piano like you as a child, and it would take me a year or 2 years to get my certificate or something of competence. That would be a project with a beginning and an end, an achievement. I can then become a member of an amateur band or orchestra or something, and become very competent, say a jazz pianist or something, and read about it, live it, know about it, have books on it and all the rest of it, and that would be serious leisure. But I also continue to practice playing the piano at parties and to relax and so on the rest of my life. So playing the piano can be a project, and it can be serious, and it can be casual. And I would say 99% of leisure activities are like that. And even some things that look casual are going to have a serious side. So for example, you could say, well, going to the pub or the cafe and chatting with your friends must be casual leisure. But when you think of young people just starting out in their social life, doing that, and learning to fit in, boy meets girl, friends meet friends, friends fit in, there's some serious work going on there in terms of socialization and fitting in and who you are. So you can even, but anyway, so when you look across the board, anything can be serious casual. So it falls down as a classification system. Then on theory, I'll just pick out one aspect. I critique about 3 theoretical issues, but one of them he has, which isn't very prominent in the research, but it is there in Stebbins' book, is that he says, in effect, he says, you can only lead a satisfactory or optimum lifestyle if you include serious leisure. And I don't think that's been proven. And the example I give is, if I'm, say, professionally or any sort of occupation, but involved, so fully committed, I suppose I have a family, children, and I'm very devoted to them and their well-being and being with them and so on, and relationships. Suppose I read 4 novels a year, go to the opera once as a treat, go to about 3 plays, go to the movies once every month or something, follow a football team, and so just go and watch them live about 3 or 4 times a year. Maybe like 2 or 3 musical artists, and so I buy their CDs or download and listen to them on my device. I'm fully engaged, I would say, culturally and with life. And yet none of that is serious leisure. And yet I could live a very cultured, fulfilled, and honourable life, I would say, without doing serious leisure. Now, if all I was doing is sitting, being miserable, I would say, yes, do some serious leisure, and your life will improve. So I think that's another bit, that it falls down both as a classification system and as a theory. Now, the other aspect of Stebbins' presentation is that he takes a whole load of other types of theory, and I can't remember them all, but one was on, there's a whole literature on other sort of motivational type things in leisure. One is specialization. There's a whole literature on it. As you become more specialized as you move into a field, an activity. There is commitment as a different type of relationship. I can't think of the others off the top of my head, but there's a whole list of them, about 5 or 6 of these things which are kind of competing theories in a way. And Stebbins has occasionally discussed them and sort of dismissed them or tucked them in under his system and said, well, that's really a variation on what I was saying over here. But I've said, well, if you take Stebbins' criteria for serious leisure and list those, and then you take the criteria for leisure specialization, take that example, and they've got some things in common, but it's got some unique characteristics, and then you take the theory on commitment, commitment over time to an activity, that's got other characteristics and motivational factors, and you take some other things like gender and friendship and class and so on, which Stebbins tends to ignore, and then there's about 3 or 4 others. You end up with a great long list that I've got about 30 or 40 criteria. And I said, this is all to do with differentiating and trying to explain leisure experience and leisure motivation. And I've just put forward as a sort of starting point to say, if you were somehow to draw on all of those you could call it the leisure experience perspective. But I don't claim that it's a fully developed thing, just an idea trying to address the exclusiveness of the serious leisure perspective.